In this part of the video, we are going to understand what is an Hibernate and what is object persistence. What is an Hibernate? Hibernate is a robust object relational mapping framework for Java that streamlines the interaction between Java application and relational databases. It provides an efficient and developer-friendly approach to database operations by allowing the use of Java objects, thereby abstracting the underlying SQL queries. The major part of development of Hibernate is whenever we try to connect to a particular database, every time we need to use JDBC APIs, which was at the first development phase. And JDBC was most popular. Using JDBC, we used to connect to the database, get all such particular. The purpose it will solve with respect to the Hibernate is as we are going with a legacy way of development where every time we need to connect to the database, and as well as we need to connect, disconnect, and as well as we are using SQL queries to connect to database and query it every time. So that there was a necessity where it should be an upgradation with respect to the smooth working process, and every time we have to work with the same, and if we forget to connect to a database, maybe closing of the particular connections, it may revert back with respect to more and more connections. So all these particular things, there was certain problems which should be provided as a solution. So Hibernate has come up with a particular framework which is gives you a flexible way of connecting to the database, and as well as accessing the particular database in such a way that it will store the rows or the tables in an object format. So with respect to that, the Hibernate also given various APIs which supports to make it more user friendly, and as well as it has given so many methods to have a smooth working process with respect to database. So it also gives the abstracting. The abstraction is actually whenever you try to write an queries and all, it is an SQL based queries or specific to the particular database. We need to write the queries and we have to connect it, we have to send that particular query, submit it, then that query will get executed as a native to a particular database, and as well as it gives you a result in a native, just gets connected to the Java application. So in that particular case we need to go with another process where the conversion will usually happens. So Hibernate has made that particular process much more simpler, and as well as it has started communicating with respect to objects. So when the objects are coming into picture, means the flexibility of storing the data in an object format, it has made it much more easier. And the particular part of development with respect to what do you say, writing an SQL queries. So the previously we have to write the native queries to the SQL to connect and get the results to be done. Now you need to write a queries on the objects, because the Hibernate, what does it do? It connects to an it converts all those particular tables into an object format, and those objects will act as a database for working on that. So Hibernate has given that kind of approach to convert those kind of operations more user friendly. Now what is object relational mapping? ORM is that where you are having your database which gets converted to a persistent, means it gives you a transparent persistent and retrieval of the objects. The persistence means what? It is exactly exist in this particular JVM. So it's a technique for converting object type data of an object oriented programming language into database tables, and it is vice versa. So it is like you are having a Java objects which acts like a table, and it is actually copying the database tables. So that is where it comes into picture. The persistent of associations and collections is an unique of a particular object within a session. We are going to talk about it. So this is called object relational mapping. Now we are trying to understand how does the Hibernate will work, and as well as what do you mean by the persistent objects. Now in a particular Java programming, what does the Java will do is you have a particular Java JVM or Java projects. Next you have a database which is getting streamlined now, right? Now in this particular database we are going to have so we have a database. Now here we are having our Java. Now to connect to the particular database to Java, what is the main basic things have been added. So it is like you are going to connect to the database, and every time we need to get back the details to it. So how it used to be, we are using a JDBC drivers and connect JDBC drivers. After that we used to connect. After that again we need to write the queries based on the database language, that is SQL, right? So this was the major part in which we need to write the queries. And what is the next thing? Database language in SQL. So whatever it returns back, it will be in the same format of the native SQL return. Okay, native SQL return. Okay, so this is how you are going to connect, and you are going to have a particular thing which gets communicated with it. Now this is the most difficult part. How does it exactly work? So now what is the next process it has been followed is that so can we segregate, or can we have in a different way as the native applications which used to work, right? So what is that we can do? That is, we can add up the other process, which is like we can have our persistent objects which are going to be kept into it. So now what is the thing? They have started with adding so many objects, right? So many objects have been started. Now how does this particular objects will work? So the objects, whatever we are seeing in here, it actually works as a particular column. It's something like if I create a particular database, so it is like, for an example, you have a student table. In that I have ID, name, address. So this particular student table which is having ID, name and address, so in this particular table I need to convert it into a Java objects. So in that case we create a class name, we create a class called student, and we will add up the variables called ID, name, address, And what does it do is, every time whenever there is a specific rows and columns which is actually placed, like 1 comma name is XYZ comma we have an address 1, so we have another one which is ABC address 2, so something like this. We have a table with the values which is actually placed for the student database. Now this this particular part, whatever we are seeing in here, is your table, and we are having our what do you say rows which is actually present for that particular table. Now we have a class which is actually defined. So what we can do right now is, each and every row whatever we are going to see can be converted to an object. Now we can take an instance of this particular class called student, and every time we fill all the details from an ID is 1, address is 2, address is ADD1, name is XYZ, so we create one object. And again there will be another row which creates another object. So this comes under one of the instance with respect to student only. Like that, the number of objects which is getting created with respect to the table. So we are actually doing a replicate of the particular rows into an objects format, right? So now what is happening, the whatever we have in table as rows, so it is getting converted to an object. So this type, where we are converting a particular property from an table to a particular object format, so we need to have a particular property is called as persistence. So we are going to have the objects which stores the rows and columns of a particular database. It is actually persist into our particular Java system. Now this part of creating a relation, so it is called as ORM, object relational mapping. So this is what it is basically called. Now what is the next process is, we are going to have an persistence with respect to Java API. Okay, so when we are understanding about the object relational mapping which is actually being done, now whatever the Java program we are going to have, we can write the queries or we can work on objects. So this particular part where Java is able to work on its own objects, and you can write any specific queries which is exactly needed. So we are running on objects, not on the database. So we are going to have a middle layer kind of thing where you can have your data which is actually stored. You can have the working process on that. You can write your queries on the objects, not on the database. So now what is happening, you are actually making a thin line which is dividing your objects with respect to database. Now whenever it is needed, you can just give a transaction process where you can commit every time to the database, or whenever the work has been completed, then you can replicate to the database. So this kind of working process which comes under the framework is called as Hibernate. The total working process which comes under the one roof is called as Hibernate. Now Hibernate is actually a process with respect to the JPA, Java Persistence API. Okay, so JPA, what does it do is, whatever we are actually having a persistent objects, so it gets converted to an API format. It gives its own libraries to communicate to the objects, and it is looking like you are actually connecting to the database itself, and you are writing queries on the database itself. So this particular whole part which comes under the Hibernate. We will be going in depth with respect to Java Persistent API. Later on, we are going to understand how does the object relational mapping will be done with respect to Java programming in Hibernate. Now coming back, why Hibernate and not JDBC? There are various advantages. As I have told you, that how does this particular JDBC will give you with respect to maps. Every time you need to connect to the database, and database types you should be knowing. So Hibernate does all this particular process automatically. So that is the only thing where you are having advantage over the JDBC. The Hibernate features is OR mapping using ordinary Java beans. So that is where Java beans are coming into picture. As I told you, thus whatever the objects we are going to see, so these are all called as Java beans. So Java beans is something like you create a class with respect to attributes, and that will store as an objects to it. So it becomes a bean concept with respect to setter and getter methods, and you have a data with respect to toString as well as constructor based. So all those particular things will join together to make a Java bean. Next, there are Hibernate features is you can set the attributes using private fields or private setter methods. Lazy instantiation of collection. Whenever it is needed, we are going to configure it. Polymorphic queries are there. Cascading persistent. Transaction management with rollback. Transaction management with rollback means what? It is gonna have a particular control over the objects. Whenever it is needed, we can roll back inside this particular Java Persistence API. So whenever we are having this particular objects, when we try to communicate, so it will have its own transactional APIs which can be added to it, and we can control the objects to get back onto the database, and also we can roll back from the objects to the database. So this kind of transactional process is also being done. So this becomes in Hibernate features more important. Next, we will understand what is an Hibernate architecture. The application architecture is having user interface, application logic, data of domain objects. Next, you are having an Hibernate framework where you are having a Hibernate API domain object which is actually present. So in Hibernate API, it is compulsory that there are certain objects which is actually working at the backend process to communicate to the database. So it is no doubt it is using JDBC at the backend, but we are going to use a session factory session. And next, we are having a session factory session. We are having queries and the process of configuration. So these are all certain objects which actually work for the Hibernate total working process. So Hibernate API will have session factory. Next, you have to create a configuration file. HBM.xml class mapping files you should be creating, so it will get converted to an whatever mapping files means what? It is like you are going to have mapping with respect to the database table. So you are going to tell what are the variables name which you are going to specify in class, and what are the real attribute columns which is actually present in that particular table. So you are going to map the class variables to the database. So this is how you are going to specify in class mapping. Now Hibernate configurations means how do we connect to the database, what is the database name, what is the URL, username and password for getting authentication total process for it. So we are going to use Hibernate configuration file. Okay, so this is how the Hibernate will take all these particular configurations, keep it ready, and it will communicate to the database using JDBC API, and whatever results it is gonna get it is gonna put it onto Hibernate, so it will convert to an objects which is there, then it is gonna communicate to your application logic layer. Now this is an Hibernate architecture. So you are having Hibernate architecture in between application and database. So Hibernate properties are there, XML mapping files are there which is present inside this. Now we will understand what is ORM. ORM is an objects, as I told you, that we are going to have objects with respect to the Java beans, and you have mapping logic to the database, relational database. So it is called as OR mapping. So it is called object relational mapping. Next, we'll understand what is ORM solutions. An API for performing basic CRUD operations on the object for persistent classes. So what is the basic purpose of this is you can have your a process like create, insert, delete, and you want to do update or any of the other operations which is actually present. So those kind of operations can be done on the persistent classes, not on the database. That's where it gives a freedom of communicating to the persistent objects, not on the particular database. A language or an API for specifying queries that refers to classes and properties of the class. Facility for specifying mapping metadata. So that is how it is ORM will give a most of the solution. A technique for ORM implementation to interact with the traditional object to perform dirty checking, lazy association, fetching, and other optimization techniques. So these are all the things where ORM gives a solution for the particular operations to be done, and it gives the independency to communicate to the database. What are the 4 levels of ORM quality? It is pure relational, light object mapping, medium object mapping, full object mapping, and generic ORM problems. These are all certain things where you are having what is that it should be there, and what are the different predefined things we should keep it whenever the Hibernate process is running. So what do persistent classes look like? How is mapping metadata defined? So how should we map class inheritance hierarchies, and how do object identity? These are all certain problems which actually exist whenever we are having our ORM. Why ORM? ORM implementation is complex, less complex than an application server, but more complex than a web application framework, like a struts and tapestry. Why should we introduce another new complex infrastructure, eliminate into our system? Will it be worth it? Yes, it is worth it. So that's a major thing where ORM gives a very good option for communicating to a database, where it gets all the table contents will be converted to an objects. So when we are doing some process on the objects, it is very good. Every time we have to write a query, connect to a database and coming back, it is a big problem. So every time we need to connect it and we have to wait for the database to respond it back. So there are certain the slower process which works on connecting to database and closing the connection, processing. So that's where the ORM gives you the faster way of development, right? So it also gives the results faster. And no doubt there will be a sync. Every time we need to sync to the database and we have to get the latest information. But Hibernate will take care of that particular objects to get updated now and then with respect to database. Benefits of ORM and Hibernate is productivity, maintainability, performance, vendor independence. Vendor independence, why? Because it is having various different vendor properties which can be added to it. Hibernate objects, which is called configuration objects. So this is the first step to understand how do we connect to the database. First we need to give an configuration details and database connection. There it contains the Hibernate properties and Hibernate config XML files, class mapping setup. All those particular things can be included inside the particular configuration.xml file. So next is session factory. This is the second part, where after you configure that particular object, you need to create a session factory object, which in turn configures Hibernate for the application using supplied configuration files. And you have a session factory object, which is an thread safe, used by all the threads of an application. So you can use the session factory wherever it is needed and necessary to create a new thread. It is thread safe. and it is heavyweight object, so usually it is created during the application startup. You can actually create this particular session factory only whenever it is needed for a new thread working process for the session. Next, session factory object per database uses a separate configuration file, so you can have a number of database configurations, and you can create a number of session factory objects whichever the database it is gonna connect. Next object is session object. Session object is used to get a physical connection with the database. So from the session factory we can extract a session, and that creates a new connection to the database, and as well as it is a lightweight and designed to instantiate each time when interaction is needed with the database. The persistent objects are saved and retrieved through a session object. The session object should not be kept open for a long time because they are not usually thread safe, and they should be created and destroyed as needed. So whenever we need a session, you can create a session, and as well as you need to close the session whenever it is not necessary for a very long time. So next is a transaction object. Transaction represent a unit of work with the database. Means what? It is going to connect from the persistent objects to the database to make it a transaction done. Okay, so that becomes a unit of work. Transaction in Hibernate is handled by an underlying transaction manager and transaction. So there are you are going to connect to a particular database, you need to create an object which is having a transaction process. So you have a Java transaction APIs which gets communicated to complete that particular transaction from a Hibernate process. This is an optional object, and Hibernate application may choose not to use this interface. Whenever it is necessary, you can use it, but if something goes wrong, you can take the transaction object and you can do rollback to the previous commit, whatever has been happened. Next is a query object. So from the session object, you are going to extract a query. So you are going to create a query, and this query object is going to do a query on the Java persistent objects, the objects which is actually created with respect to the database as their database tables as a mapping. So you are going to do a query on the particular object. So you are going to use a new query language which is called as Hibernate query language. Hibernate query language. The query instance is used to bind query properties to execute the query. So you have understood till now there are 4-5 different objects which is present, and it is very much important to connect to the database. One is configuration object, session factory object, session object, and transaction object is an optional, and query object you are having the query to just do a query with the database. Okay, now before we go to the Hibernate query options, we will do a small exercise regarding how we can have our projects to be created. Now, to project to be created, okay, we will go back to this particular Eclipse. In the particular Eclipse, we will try to understand that how do we create an object for doing an Hibernate process. You just click on new and go to the Maven project. In the Maven project, you can just click on create a simple project. Next, give a group ID which is I'm just giving as test Hibernate. Okay, now I click on finish. So packaging is of type is jar based. So I have created a particular Maven based project. Now in this particular pom.xml file, I need the dependencies to be added. So what kind of dependencies? To be added? So we are going to understand what kind of dependencies to be added. So we need dependencies something like, first dependency we are going to add is called Hibernate JPA, Hibernate core and Hibernate validator. So first is MySQL connector. We are going to connect to the MySQL database. So we are going to use these particular 3 different repositories, which is called as MySQL connector J, Hibernate validator, Hibernate core. In these particular dependencies, I am going to add the dependencies. So it is giving me some kind of error that dependencies closing tag. Okay, I've closed it properly with respect to dependencies. Okay. So we have added the dependencies. Now you can see that the Maven dependency is just added with respect to all those things whichever is needed for me to work on that. So first is Hibernate core, MySQL, and as well as Hibernate different process. So this is your first process to create an project on that, right? So this is your first process. Next, afterwards, this is about the demo of creating a particular project. We'll go with the presentation. The Hibernate query options, it is actually an minimal object oriented dialect of ANSI SQL. So it is actually giving you a lot of options with respect to how we write an SQL query language, and it is actually suitable to write a Hibernate query options. How does it convert? So what is the main purpose of using Hibernate query language? Make SQL be an object-oriented classes and properties instead of tables and columns, polymorphism, associations. It is much less verbose than SQL. Full support for relational operations in router, full join, projection, aggregation, ordering, subqueries, SQL function calls, all those particular, even aggregate functions are actually present, which look like an SQL, but we are going to write a query on Hibernate query language. So we are going to write HQL language, and we are going to have all the options of an SQL query. Hibernate query language for taking about sets of objects, it unifies relational operations. Here we can understand Hibernate query language. Simplest HQL query is from auction item. Here we just understand that auction item is a class. It is not a table which is connecting to a database. So you are just writing from auction item. So you are going to call from class. Immediately what does it do? It gets all the details which is actually present in that particular table, which is mapped. So we are going to do an Hibernate mapping, and I'll just tell you about it, how to do the mapping. So whatever it is mapped to the table, all those particular things get converted to an Java objects, and from the Java objects it is going to give as a list format. So you are going to get it as a collection format. So that is where it is called as Hibernate query language. Hibernate query language will look like an SQL, but it is not SQL. We are going to write the queries on the objects, which is the collection of objects which is present. So based on that particular objects, we are going to write a query and extracting the data details on that. Hibernate query language will have all the options, like I can use join, where, order. So all those particular things can be used as an SQL. It looks like an SQL. So you can see aggregate functions can be used. Okay. So this is how the Hibernate query language will look like. This is your end of the theory part of an SQL query language. Thank you.